I'm Cindy Kelly, Atomic Heritage Foundation, and I'm in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. It is
11th.
Friday, May 11, 2018, and I have with me Spencer Weart. My first question is to ask him to say his name and spell it.
I'm Spencer Weart, W-E-A-R-T, like heart.
Great. So Spencer, you are a physicist. You had an early career in science. Tell us about your childhood and a little bit about how you became interested in science and science history.
Well, I grew up in a suburb of New York City, Larchmont, upper middle class family, good education, good schools, good science teachers. When I was taking physics in high school, Sputnik came along. Space was very exciting, science fiction, all that kind of thing. So I thought, okay, I'll be a physicist. And went to Cornell, and the physics department there was a very good one. And then from there went on to standard career, University of Colorado, Boulder. Not the most standard source, but it was near the mountains and the skiing, which was always probably the second most important thing in my life, until, of course, my wife and family came along. And the going thing in Boulder was solar physics, which later on contributed to my career in history of science because I became interested in climate change. But solar physics at the time was an exciting field, a lot of space stuff and so forth. So I got my degree there, went to some solar eclipses, which was very exciting, and went to Caltech, jointly with a fellow of the Mount Wilson and Palomar observatories, and did solar physics work and worked on various solar telescopes and so forth, published some papers, one of which was reprinted and became fairly widely cited. But the next career opportunity for me probably would have been to go to NASA to work on a space solar telescope, and it did not appeal to me. The field of solar physics did not strike me as a very exciting field, and as it turned out, the solar telescope that I would have been working on was delayed for many years and finally scheduled to fly on the next flight after the Challenger. So probably my sense that this was not a good career path had some validity behind it. Meanwhile, all of my life I'd been interested in history. It had been my second major interest, and I remember when I was at Cornell, I took a graduate level seminar, and the professor at the end of the term asked me what I was going to do, and I said I was going to be a physicist. And he said, "Oh, what a pity. Well, couldn't you be a historian of science?" And I thought, what a ridiculous idea. But then I thought, well, maybe so. And at that time I was courting my wife. She introduced me to a person who was an anthropologist, and introduced me to Thomas Kuhn and other writings in history of science. I said, okay, maybe that's a career path. And I was in the lucky generation. I was born in 1942, so there was huge opportunities as the baby boomers crept up on us demanding education. So I was actually able to take some time off and go back to school, University of California at Berkeley, and in effect take a second PhD, although University of California wisely doesn't give PhDs to people who already have them. So I became educated in history of science, and as I was beginning to look for a job, one of my professors there, Roger Hans, said, "I have an interesting proposition for you. There's a man in Geneva called Lou Kowarski who wants somebody to arrange his papers. And maybe he wants somebody to write his biography, I don't know, but he wants somebody to arrange his papers, and I have some money for you." This is very typical, and it shows up all the time in the French story also. Again and again, some young person finds a patron who digs up some money for them to go and do some research. So I went to Geneva, went to Lou Kowarski, and got ever more fascinated by the story of the French nuclear energy developments.
Well, that's an excellent introduction to our main topic here, which is French nuclear developments. So I think that the best place to start maybe is with Marie Curie and her husband, and what they did in terms of creating the foundation for atomic science.
Well, it all starts with Marie Curie, a vivacious, very determined redhead from Poland, went to Paris, as many Poles did, because it was under Russian control at the time, and the only way that they could advance, and even a man, let alone a woman, lived in a garret, practically starved, made her way up, found patrons in the usual fashion, and eventually managed to carve out a scientific career for herself. Married Pierre Curie, who was already a very distinguished person in the French scientific establishment. And as part of her development of science, came across this very exciting new thing by Becquerel, which was one of the patrons and older figures in the French establishment, this thing that they were beginning to call radioactivity. And she decided to pursue it. And at one point, her husband Pierre joined her because he was equally a brilliant scientist, and in particular had devised an instrument that could measure radioactivity very well. And jointly, but with Marie as the driving force in this particular case, they discovered radium, which immediately made an enormous impression on people. Here was this mysterious force of energy. It glowed in the dark. It had perhaps spiritual powers. It certainly had powers to heal, or at least to cause bodily changes and so forth. And as Pierre quickly recognized, it gave off heat, which means that there was a source of energy in here. In fact, it seemed like an endless source of energy that, as people gradually came to realize, had been in the nucleus of the atom since the creation. So immediately, not so much Pierre and Marie, but many other scientists began to explain that this could do almost anything you like. There could be the transmutation of the elements, new alchemy. There could be endless source of energy. There could be enormous weapons. People, when they think of new energy sources, pretty quickly think of weapons. So by, let's say, 1910, all these ideas, certainly by 1915 or 1920, all of these ideas, nuclear reactors, atomic-powered flying cars, atomic bombs, were all out there in the world. This naturally contributed greatly to Marie's renown, Pierre's too, but of course he died early in a tragic street accident. And so Marie Curie became sort of the iconic nuclear scientist, not just the iconic woman scientist, which is also the case, but an icon of the progress of science.
Okay, in 1925, she hired an elegant young man who had little training in scientific research, whose name was Frédéric Joliot. Tell us about this man.
Well, Frédéric Joliot, Fred, was an engineer. He came up through the normal French circles, and it was only because one of his teachers, Langevin, who was one of the senior figures in the Curie circle, and in fact Marie Curie's former lover, as it turned out, and close friend, recognized that Joliot had something more than the normal engineer. And so he referred her to the Radium Institute, which Marie Curie had founded with the help of the other French establishment figures. And Joliot went in and started to do some research there, and it soon became apparent that he was not only a very personable and dynamic young man, but a brilliant scientist as well. He was very good with people, he was very good with instruments, he was very good with all of these things. And in the Radium Institute, he encountered the daughter of one of Marie and Pierre Curie's two daughters. They had an artistic daughter who became a well-known novelist, and they had a scientist's daughter, Irene. And Irene, a couple years older than Joliot, they had things in common. They shared the French scientific culture. They shared political views, which were what we would now call mildly on the left, progressive, vaguely socialist, but just vaguely so. Mainly their main political views were that science was a great thing and should be supported. And she too was a brilliant scientist. So they were thrown together. Fred was very handsome. Irene was a more serious person. They got married. People in the French scientific establishment, gossiping as the French always do, will say, oh, Fred was just trying to advance his career and blah, blah, blah. He was the prince consort, Irene being the princess, the daughter of the queen, and so forth and so forth. But the French loved to gossip, and nobody ever told me that there was any problem in their marriage. As far as one knows, it was a completely successful marriage right to the end. So after Marie Curie became famous, she became also a symbol for the need of scientists, in particular French scientists, for money. It science in the 19th century had been a matter of individuals with a little support here and there from philanthropists or from their family money and so forth. By the early 20th century, you needed more money. You needed more scientists, and the scientists needed more materials. In particular, Marie Curie needed radium, which was a very expensive thing. So there were some possibilities for hooking up with industrialists, but it was mainly from philanthropists and from the French government that the French scientific establishment sought money. And Marie Curie became very useful to them as this famous and notoriously selfless and dedicated figure going around in her black dress to ministers and to philanthropists and so forth and asking for money for science. And the result eventually was the Radium Institute, which was a whole building on its own in the Latin Quarter near the Sorbonne and so forth, plus funding to bring in young people such as Joliot.
Tell about Joliot almost quit the field of science in 1930 when he wasn't able to find a teaching position, a position in a college. And that relates to what you just said about the funding.
Yeah, it was a constant struggle for funding, and particularly as you needed, if you wanted to do science competitively on an international scale, you needed to bring up more and more young people. And the French scientific establishment had a very difficult time doing it. Of course, the First World War had wrecked the economy, and then by 1930, the Depression was in play. The French government, in what we now recognize as completely futile thing, kept cutting its funding and therefore getting less taxes and therefore cutting its funding again. So there was very little government money. Philanthropists were cutting back, and sort of by the skin of his teeth, thanks to great efforts by Marie Curie and by Langevin and others, that he managed to secure some funds to keep going.
So who was, can you tell us a little bit about Ms. Maloney, this American journalist?
Right. Mrs. William Maloney, as she liked to be called, Marie Maloney, heard somewhere that there was many times more radium in the United States than Marie Curie had in her lab, the United States being a rich country and France not supporting its science. So she invited Marie over for a tour. Marie Maloney was a journalist. She was an editor of a women's magazine, very good writer herself, wonderful publicist. So Marie went on a tour, shuttled around from place to place. Marie Curie was shy, but she was willing to stand up and read her lines and say that science was necessary. So they said, we're going to get Marie Curie a gram of radium. We'll raise enough funds to get her a gram of radium. And they did that, mostly from Americans, including children, little girls, sending their pennies and so forth. And they raised the money to buy Marie Curie a gram of radium. And of course, French philanthropists and the French government, shamed, had to give some comparable support. It was one of the things that undergirded the Radium Institute. And incidentally, the work for which Joliot and Irene Curie won the Nobel Prize was done with a part of that gram of radium.
Do you remember how much the money that the Americans raised?
I don't remember offhand.
Yeah,
on the order of $1 million. You could look it up.
Yeah.
A lot of money in those days. Radium was wanted for medical uses. It was Pierre Curie carried around a bit of radium in his pocket and found that he got a skin lesion next to it. That was the first sign of what radium could do. And it turned out to be useful in treating surface cancers, skin cancers, and things like that.
To touch on him, since you raised him.
I should also say that the medical uses of radium were also a main impetus behind all the funding for the Radium Institute. And throughout their careers, and later on through the Pierre and Marie Curie, and then later on Joliot, throughout their careers, the medical uses of nuclear energy were one of the main things that they talked about, one of the main things that they used to raise funds for. And it's worth saying that today, every year, more lives are saved by nuclear energy than were lost at Hiroshima by a factor of 10.
Per year?
Yeah, per year, yeah.
That's great.
So they weren't mistaken.
What's that?
They weren't mistaken in looking to the medical uses.
No, right. So before the war, there were a lot of different countries who were on to what might be inside the atom in terms of energy and how to harness it. Can you briefly talk about where the French were in terms of their efforts and how they progressed with?
Yeah, there was international competition. The leading people were obviously in Britain, Germany, and France. In France, being primarily because of the Curie family, that was more restricted than in Germany and Britain. They were spattered around a little more. There was a team in Italy under Fermi, thanks only to Fermi and to a senator who managed to dig up the funds for them. And then there was the rising power in the United States, which more and more economically strong and more scientists scattered around. And then if there were people elsewhere, Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen, there were people in Austria, there was people in the Soviet Union who were doing good work. So there was a lot of people going around, and they were exchanging papers, they were meeting at conferences, people even went to the Soviet Union to attend conferences. So there was an international community of friendly rivals. They would all be very happy to get together and exchange ideas with each other, but they also would be very happy to go home and try to get their paper published first.
So when did that, or what did Joliot contribute? What was he doing with his team?
Well, Joliot first did some research on his own, and then he very felicitously teamed up with Irene. Joliot was the brilliant physicist. Irene was the methodical and persistent chemist in the team, which made a very good team for the kind of radioactivity research that people were doing at the time. And they began to produce results, nothing epic-making, but serious results that got them, in fact, invited to one of these conferences, the Solvay conference, which is one of the places where all the nuclear and quantum physics people got together. So they had reached a fairly prestigious level through the kind of publications that everybody was doing, finding a little bit about this and finding a little bit about that. They almost found the neutron. They found a peculiar phenomenon which they couldn't explain, and Chadwick in England explained it. Oh, this is a neutron. And darn, we missed it, if we'd only been able to figure out. And then they found some other thing, and what is this going on? We found it, and somebody else explained it's the positron. Okay, oh, darn, we missed the positron. Then they found another peculiar phenomenon when what you did in radioactivity in those days was you bombarded particles with other particles, and so I came out and tried to figure out what it told you about what was going on inside the nucleus. So they bombarded alpha particles, which came from this radium that had been donated to Marie Curie, and they bombarded aluminum foil with it, and positrons came out. So what is going on in here? And they had theories about it. Maybe the neutron is actually, an atomic nucleus is a neutron plus a positron and so forth. And they took this to the Solvay conference, and people poo-pooed it and so forth. But Niels Bohr took them aside and said, keep on with it. Don't be discouraged. So they went back, and they finally, through kind of an accident, found it's like Becquerel with his radioactivity when he was trying to find what was happening by shining sunlight on something he thought was phosphorescent, and when there was a cloudy day, the thing continued to emit rays. Well, the same thing happened with them. At one point, Joliot took away his source from the aluminum foil, and the Geiger counter continued to tick. So something was going on in here, and in fact, what they found out was that they had made the aluminum radioactive. They had changed the aluminum into, as it turned out, into radioactive phosphorus. So can this be true? And so call on Irene Curie to do find a way to extract phosphorus from aluminum in 3 minutes before the radioactivity decayed, and she managed to do that. And they found that it really was radioactive phosphorus, and at this point, so at this point, Joliot started dancing around the room. So, with the neutron, we were too late. With the positron, we were too late. Now we are on time. And so, and this won them the Nobel Prize, which sold the discovery of artificial radioactivity, that you bombard certain elements with other elements, and you can make an entirely new element, which is radioactive, which was immediately recognized as something that could have profound medical uses. In Great Britain, Szilard was stepping off a curb one day, and a flash of insight came to him that if what if you could make a chain reaction with this? What if you could bombard something and it bombarded something else in turn and made more of it? Could you make an atomic bomb? He kind of kept that to himself, but this was one of the consequences of the discovery of artificial radioactivity, actually predicted in 1913 by H.G. Wells in a novel about atomic bombs. It's worth pointing out that this did great things for the Curie Institute and for radioactivity and for women in science and all those kinds of things. What a romantic story. Pierre and Marie Curie won a Nobel Prize by working jointly. Their daughter and son-in-law win a Nobel Prize by doing joint research. Never happened before, never happened since. It's a unique circumstance, wonderful romantic story, and of course helped the French scientific community in going about to increase their contacts with industry, increase their contacts with politicians, all in the primary aim of increasing funding for science, which to them was the single best route to a wonderful future.
So after that prize and such, how did their lives change? Were they able to get more funding? And
There's a lot more money. There's a lot more money. But not only because of the Nobel Prize, this was also the years in which the Popular Front came to power. The Popular Front represented to a substantial extent the ideals of the French scientific community, through no coincidence, because these people had all gone to school together at the École Normale. They were all leftist leaning. They all believed in progress. The Third Republic ideal of liberating people from clerical superstitions through the advance of rationality and science. So it was entirely natural for the Popular Front to pour extra funding into science, and indeed Irene became a subsecretary for a while in the Popular Front government. And meanwhile, Joliot was busy using all those funds to start building up his laboratories. The great new thing was atom smashers, very large and expensive devices. He got advice from Ernest Lawrence in Berkeley on how to build a cyclotron, and he started building up the whole. He got a professorship, with Langevin's help. He got a professorship at the Collège de France, which is the most prestigious ancient scientific institution, and began to tear down walls and bring in workmen to put up all this laboratory thing. So for the next few years, he was primarily administrating the development of more nuclear energy labs.
you had mentioned the Radium, what do they call it? The
Radium Institute?
Yeah, the Radium Institute. And is that what they, well, that was Marie Curie's. E.O. Lawrence's, the Rad Lab.
Yeah, his radiation
right.
lab at Berkeley.
And there was some sense of competition here between the radiation laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley. So,
well, again, this is the friendly competition. It's great that somebody discovers artificial radioactivity, but nice for us that we were the one to find it first. Cyclotrons, let's build cyclotrons and see who can discover things with them. Lawrence sent people to other labs around the world to help them to learn how to build cyclotrons. He sent people to Joliot to help them work out how to build a cyclotron. So this was a cooperative enterprise in which you helped each other to make discoveries, but you just wanted to be the one who made the discovery first. There was occasionally some kinds of bad feelings. In particular, as it happened, it developed some bad feelings between Irene and the team in Berlin, Lise Meitner and so forth, because when Irene came up with some results that Lise Meitner said, that's all wrong, it's ridiculous, she's stupid. But it turned out that in this particular case, Meitner was wrong. So there was a certain amount of bad feeling that developed, which eventually leads into the discovery of fission's story. So while Joliot was as busy with his administrative stuff, Irene, after she left the government, went back to her work doing radiochemistry. And she came up with some very peculiar results that she could not explain. Her and another foreign person working with her, because the Radium Institute was full of foreigners, thanks to Marie Curie's Polish heritage. She welcomed foreign visitors. So with a man named Savage, Irene was investigating uranium, which was the heaviest element and had peculiar characteristics, and people were investigating everything, again, bombarding stuff and seeing what came out and trying to figure out what it was. And she found these very peculiar results. And Hahn and Meitner and Strassmann, who were in Berlin, thought again that she was completely wet and she just didn't know what she was doing and couldn't do the chemistry properly. But Irene got provoked by this and went back and did more work and more precise, meticulous, careful work, and pinned down very definitely that yes, she had found this thing which couldn't be explained. And again, it was perhaps if Fred had been working with her at that time, they would have solved it. But as it turned out, it was Hahn who solved it and said, wait a minute, this is actually the uranium nucleus breaking in half. And he said, what he actually said was, maybe it's the uranium nucleus breaking in half. And then Meitner and Frisch, Meitner had to leave Germany because he was Jewish. And with Frisch, they figured out that it was actually nuclear fission. So again, Irene Curie was the person who put Hahn and the others on the trail to nuclear fission. She just hadn't made the final step herself.
And that's the trail that they first said that's going nowhere, that she had not...
Yeah, she thought she was just doing her chemistry wrong.
Yeah.
But when they redid the chemistry and they redid it and they kept getting these completely weird results, which turns out that, at the time, everybody understood that what you do was you bombard a nucleus with a thing, you bombard it with a little thing, and other little things come out. The nucleus transforms and it spits out a little bit of itself, or something happens, and you get basically the same nucleus with slight changes. So it was a complete break with the normal way of doing things to imagine that the thing would just break in half.
And also release
energy. It was immediately recognized. Right. You ask any physicist and you say, oh, a heavy nucleus breaks into two smaller nuclei. And any physicist in the world says, wow, energy will come out.
And why is that? How do we know that happens?
Oh, well, because E equals mc squared. And because if you add up the mass of the two smaller parts that come out, the mass of these two smaller elements, and compare with the mass of the uranium nucleus, you find that some mass has been lost. So where did that mass go? It went into energy. So immediately every physicist in the world who heard about this went into his lab and started to look for the energy that came out, including Joliot. And he found it, and people congratulated him. And he said, oh, wow, you've proved that fission produces energy. And he shrugged and says, well, everybody else in the world has already found this this week. Which was true. Lots of people did the experiment and found that energy was coming out.
So what did Joliot, or is this the next thing you might talk about, is what he then started to pursue in terms of trying to harness that energy? So
the next thing is this is what people have been talking about since the discovery of radioactivity. For 40 years, people have been saying that we might be able to put this energy to good use. Now, finally, we have found something that might be able to do that. The basic scientific question there is whether you can make a chain reaction. This was what Szilard had realized when he stepped off the curve. If you can get one to make another and the other to make another, then maybe you can get energy. But the question is, if you split one nucleus and it gives out neutrons, as it turns out, and they hit another nucleus and make it split, when you make one split, do you get then enough neutrons to make two split, and then 4 and 8 and 16 and so forth on up? Or less than that, maybe you split one and then maybe another one will split, and that gives another one split, and then nothing happens. You don't have an actual expanding chain reaction. So the crucial question was, do you get a multiplication? And this was, as it turned out, a difficult thing to find out. And Joliot, in order to do that, at this point you needed a team. Science was getting bigger, science was getting harder, science was getting more expensive. You needed to have more than just one person working on it. By this time, Joliot had finished pretty much all this construction work. His cyclotron and so forth, his atom smashers were up, and he was ready to turn to an actual scientific problem. This was obviously one of the biggest scientific problems of the time. So he looked around for help, and the first person he came to was Hans Holbein. Holbein was Austrian and grew up in Switzerland, where his father was a professor, came from reasonably wealthy, cultured, German-speaking environment, married money, so he was even more wealthy, debonair, pretty good scientist, not brilliant, but he could do the work. And then there was another person, Lou Kowarski, who was the only person I've mentioned so far that I've met, actually, and worked with. Lou Kowarski is an enormous bear of a man, but like some big men, very meticulous, very precise. And he had been born out of wedlock between a Jew and a Christian in Russia. His father managed to get, the marriage wasn't a marriage, but the relationship broke up. So Kowarski grew up in a very unsettled environment, not to mention being in Russia through the First World War, and got smuggled out basically to Vilno, and then from there, like so many Eastern Europeans, found refuge in the scientific community in Paris. Trained as an engineer, went on to get a PhD. I can say he was also a very sharp scientist. Kowarski once asked me, he said, "You say here that I'm a very good scientist. How do you know that? All the work I did is in collaboration." And I said, "Oh, well, I looked at your PhD thesis." And his PhD thesis was actually, it was ahead of its time. So he was a good scientist. He had a sharp mind. So he, like so many people, was scrambling for work. He worked for some time as Joliot's secretary. He was the petit dactylo. I mean, he was big. He was Joliot's little typist. But also did scientific research. He was getting his PhD. And he knew Holbein, who had come to work in the Radium Institute with Irene and the other people there, and sort of came under Holbein's wing. He said, "I want to learn to do nuclear physics." Heck with it. He was an engineer for a steel pipe factory and working part-time as a secretary and research assistant. He said, "I want to be a nuclear physicist." So Holbein said, "Okay, let me show you the ropes." And then when Joliot was starting to assemble a team, Holbein went to Joliot and said, "Why don't we bring Kowarski in too?" And Joliot, this is all oral history now, so we don't know for sure, but Kowarski's story is that Joliot said, "This could make his name. Do we want to do that?" And Holbein says, "Yeah, that's okay. He's good enough." So they formed a team, and Joliot was obviously the driving force, but we can't know when you have these small scientific teams who came up with which ideas. They probably, the ideas circulate around and come out, and finally they worked out ways to try to figure out how to find out whether or not this chain reaction was possible. How do you find out if there's a chain reaction? Well, you have to take some uranium and you have to put it in a moderator, something that will knock the neutrons around and slow them down. The only moderators that seemed plausible were graphite, carbon, and heavy water. Graphite has a problem that it has impurities. It's very hard to get them out. Heavy water has problems that it's hard to make. You have to distill regular water. Heavy water has hydrogen, has an extra neutron on it. But because the hydrogen has extra neutron on it, doesn't absorb neutrons, so they'll scatter around in the heavy water indefinitely. So uranium was hard to come by, and heavy water was hard to come by. So what do? Well, this was the spirit of the French scientific establishment. You cooperate with industry, you cooperate with government. So maybe I'll start with the uranium. For the uranium, the richest uranium mines in the world are in the Congo. One has the uranium that's so rich that it made a nuclear reactor all by itself when water seeped into it, a long time ago. And the owner of the Congo was the Union Minière de Haute-Katanga. And so they went to the Union Minière, which was in Belgium. And they said, let's make a deal with you. We'll take out some patents on our ideas. We'll share the patents with you. You give us some uranium. We'll make some kind of a joint venture. This is the scientists trying to get themselves embedded in the world of industry. And of course, since they were already embedded with government, they also went to the government for funds. And in particular for the heavy water, the heavy water came from Norsk Hydro. There was a hydroelectric plant in Norway that produced small quantities of heavy water just for doing research and so forth. And but they'd been building up. They'd set up their distilleries, and it turns out that they had, gallons and gallons of the stuff that they sold. They just kept accumulating because they had the thing set up. And at this point, they recognized that they were in a race, and in particular with Germany. This was 1939, and almost everybody was aware that a war was coming. At this point, people were aware that an atomic bomb was at least a remote possibility. If not an atomic bomb, then certainly things of very grave economic importance. So it became a question actually of national security. So they went to a man named Joliot-Curie, who was one of the top bureaucrats, engineer bureaucrats. He later on wound up reforming the French railway system, that kind of a person, and in touch with the military in particular. And they organized a mission to go to Norsk Hydro clandestinely so that the Germans wouldn't find out about it and grab it first, and buy their heavy water and bring it to France, which worked. It was a kind of a cloak and dagger operation because Kowarski had a Russian accent, Halban had a very strong German accent, so they were put away on an island so they couldn't reveal any secrets until the heavy water reached France. So then they put the uranium together with the heavy water, and they found that yes, you get more neutrons out than you put in. Yes, a chain reaction is possible. And this had also been recognized in Colombia, where Leo Szilard was. Szilard wrote to everybody saying, if you find out that there's a chain reaction, for God's sake, don't tell anybody. Joliot's people said, you're trying to keep us from publishing this. Everybody's going to know it pretty soon anyway, so they published the result. And at this point, basically, at this point, the race for the atomic bomb was on.
So what year was that?
1939.
So just months after the publication in Nature.
Yeah, uranium fission, the idea of uranium fission was published. Many people immediately confirmed that fission released energy. Finding that neutron multiplication was possible was much harder, so that took some months, but that was, I think, around March or April, I'm not sure, around then. And at that point, fairly soon after that, nuclear research began to go dark. It didn't take long before people hooked up with their governments and started to say, well, yeah. And of course, then the war started, which was definitive. There's another, interestingly, the Union-Minière story has further ramifications. This, of course, alerted the Union-Minière of the importance of its uranium stocks, which were massive. Uranium was useful mainly because you could refine radium from it, but also it could be used as industrial uses. It made nice yellow colorant in pottery and so forth. The Union-Minière had a warehouse full of it. When the war came, in probably typical Belgian fashion, they left half of it for the Germans to capture and shipped the other half to the United States. And when the Manhattan Project started looking around for uranium, naturally they went to the Union-Minière and they said, where's the uranium? And they said, well, half of it is in Staten Island. And that's the uranium that blew up Hiroshima. So again, this is traced back directly to the French initiative in forming the Union-Minière. Incidentally, the Union-Minière also shipped some freight cars full of uranium to France, where they were conveniently lost on a siding during the entire war and recovered afterwards and helped to fuel the first French nuclear reactor.
Conveniently lost.
Oh, don't know the full story.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Did the Germans get their half? I mean, they confiscated it and took it back to Germany?
I can't say I believe so. They never seem to have, but of course they also captured the mines, and they owned the mines in Austria, which also produced lots of uranium. So I don't know that they particularly needed it for the small research project that they had. The further saga of heavy water, people have made books and movies out of it. Joliot-Curie learned at a meeting that the Germans had broken through. They were going to capture Paris. One of the first things he did was to tell Joliot, take your team, take the heavy water, take everything, and evacuate. They went down to Clermont-Ferrand, which was supposed to be the next capital of the Third Republic. So they piled the stuff into cars and got some army trucks and drove down there. Very soon the word came, no, you're not going to get here. Joliot-Curie wanted to evacuate everything from France. He wanted the entire French army to move to North Africa. He was one of the true patriots. Some of the other French politicians were more willing to give in to the Germans on the basis of better the Nazis than the communists. Joliot and his team were directed to go to Bordeaux, which was the last capital of the Third Republic, with their heavy water. And there Joliot-Curie's people directed them to a British collier that was in the port. And they took their heavy water on board and were evacuated to England, bombs falling about them and that kind of a thing. Joliot decided to stay. Joliot was very French patriot. Halban and Kowarski, of course, did not have such close connections. And by the way, this is worth saying. Kowarski once told me, in France he was always a Russian Jew. When he came to the United States for a few months to teach at Boston University, he felt more welcome and at home in the United States than he'd ever in his life felt in France. And Halban, with his German accent, must surely have felt similar. Joliot, on the other hand, decided to stay in France on the understanding that the Germans would not be there forever. Sooner or later, and Joliot quite correctly predicted they would get into war with the Soviet Union. And meanwhile, people needed to stay in France to, one, maintain French culture and science, and two, resist.
So tell us about the resistance and what role Joliot had in that.
This, of course, is hard to know about because they didn't keep any records. But there doesn't seem to be any doubt that Joliot gradually became one of the leaders of the resistance. He was a very prestigious person, so that he was able to command a certain respect among people. The resistance in France, of course, was not at first organized at all, and Joliot, and it was underground. Joliot went back to the Collège de France. He set up new scientific work. He got to work on his cyclotron. The Germans gave him a person by the name of Gentner, who had worked with Joliot at the Radium Institute some years earlier, was friendly to him. One doesn't know whether Gentner deliberately covered up, helped Joliot cover up his activities, or whether Gentner didn't know about them. But as things progressed and the resistance became more organized, Joliot began to do resistance activities. We don't know much of what they were, but we know that he did help mobilize people. Radios were made for the resistance in the Collège de France under the Germans' noses. Only in the few last weeks of the war, Joliot had to go underground. We're not quite sure why, but he had to go and live incognito just towards the very end, before the Germans left. He could very easily have been betrayed by somebody, taken, tortured, and killed. This is what happened to leading people when they were found. At some point during this, he joined the Communist Party. The Communist Party had already been underground before the Germans arrived, and so it was the best place to organize the resistance. Also, they had established a reputation during the late 30s of being progressive for the working people, particularly belief in science as the route to progress was a pure Marxist philosophy. They, unlike the socialists of the Popular Front government. They had supported the resistance to fascism in Spain. All of these things made the Communist Party quite popular and acceptable among French intellectuals, and it was quite natural for Joliot to join the party as part of his resistance activities.
And ironically, the Americans at least suspected that Joliot might be a collaborator with the Nazis. So.
Well, there he was in his lab running a cyclotron and so forth, and promising all kinds of great nuclear discoveries would come out of a cyclotron. Of course, nothing ever came of it, but they managed to keep their funding and keep people out of the army, which was an important thing in France in those days, to keep young men from being, not out of the army, keep them from being deported to work on farms and factories in Germany, which is what happened to young men. So they managed to keep some young men out of that and keep as you said, keep French science alive, and also unknown to the Germans, help out with the resistance.
In your book, you talk about how Joliot was kind of clearly in charge of his lab. He told Gentner, or the Germans who had come to work at the lab, take advantage of the equipment he had, that they couldn't remove the equipment and that they couldn't work on anything that related to weapons or...
Of course, the Germans wanted Vichy France to be an ally, or at least not to be an enemy, so they cultivated cultural relations with the French. You know, prominent Germans went to give lectures in France, and they wanted to show that there were people of the French elite who could cooperate and collaborate with the Nazis. And Joliot's lab was set up as one of those examples, as a place that showed that Germans and French could get along together. So they allowed Joliot to stay in charge. They didn't try to pack up the cyclotron back to Germany. It was probably much better to leave it running where it was, and Germans would come and work with the French, and everybody would be great friends and so forth. So that was the setup. To the Germans, it was a nice propaganda thing. To Joliot, it was a facade that allowed him to do what he wanted to do in the interests of France. The Americans were suspicious of Joliot from the start, but that was probably mainly when they found out that he was a communist, because that was, to most Americans, being a communist was a lot worse than being a fascist, unfortunately.
Well, we left off at Bordeaux with a ship sailing and Kowalski and Halban on board. So what happened next?
Well, this is another saga. So Halban and Kowalski went to Britain. The British were pioneers in the race for the atomic bomb. They were the ones who would have a bomb dropped on them first if the Germans got it. They conceived themselves as a race for the Germans. It was also in Britain that it was first recognized how to make an atomic bomb, that you didn't need many tons, as everybody had thought, but that all you needed was pounds. This was the discovery of fission pyrals that was conveyed to the British government, and that, in fact, the Germans and the Japanese never did figure out. And the Americans learned about it only from the British. So the British were hell-bent on working towards, the first people to recognize an atomic bomb was feasible in time to affect the war. And so they would take any help they could get. So they set up Halban and Kowalski with their heavy water to start doing more of the same kind of research that they had been doing. And Halban, as conceiving himself as the senior person, and Kowalski as his worker, Halban conceiving himself as Joliot's representative, and therefore the representative of French science, tried to insert himself into as the representative of France in all of these deliberations and negotiations which developed between Britain and the United States. There was a period of cooperation in which the British gave the United States everything they could, including not only ideas about nuclear energy, but most importantly radar and all these other things. And then it gradually developed into a period in which the United States tried to take as much as they could from Britain and keep it for themselves and not let the British share in the benefits of it. And this was the way things developed. Halban and Kowarski were brought over eventually to Canada as being a much safer place to work than in Britain. Another person who had been in close contact with Joliot, Bertrand Goldschmidt, who also escaped from France and wound up in the Manhattan Project laboratory in Chicago, where they needed radiochemists, which was radioactivity, people expert in the chemistry of radioactive substances, which Goldschmidt was. So he worked in the Manhattan Project. So these Frenchmen scattered about, not entirely trusted by the Americans because they were French and they even knew communists, or at least had friends who were communists and so forth. So the British set them up in Canada as a way to maintain at least some independence from the Manhattan Project. Information about the Manhattan information necessarily leaked both ways. The Manhattan Project was set up by General Groves to try to keep everybody compartmentalized. The scientists quickly understood that if you compartmentalized everything, nobody would learn anything from anybody else, and they would never get anything done whatsoever. So they were perfectly free in passing information back and forth, and this included back and forth with the British team, or we might probably call it the Franco-British-Canadian team that was set up in Canada. And their setup was to produce a nuclear reactor, if you will, in order to maintain their independence from the American Manhattan Project, with a view towards post-war applications, both civilian nuclear reactors, nuclear energy, and eventually in the nuclear weapons. So this was the British entry. This was the British horse in the race towards post-war nuclear energy, was the team set up in Canada.
So what kind of reactors were they building?
You know, Kowarski was there when there's a nice acronym. So ZEEP was the Canadian Heavy Water Reactor, which built with a lot of work by the British, with some help from American information and so forth. The point is that they set up a reactor, got it working, developed teamwork, expertise, connections with industry and the military, and then were brought back to England and ultimately became the seed of the British nuclear energy program. The roots of all reactors in the Great Britain and all the reactors that they built elsewhere in the world, the roots of Great Britain's nuclear deterrent, which is, one of the world's major powers. All of those go back to Canada and the Franco-British team in Canada.
So there was some problem with the Canadian operations in that Groves was very upset with Halban and his close relationship with Joliot and a trip that he took
I don't remember the details of that. The general rule here is that Groves was suspicious of any foreign scientist, and particularly those who wanted to meddle in what he considered the Americans' interests through trying to get patents and making their own independent relationships with industry. He was particularly concerned, as was Halban, with the power of patents, which of course was not the case. Governments do what they want to do and don't pay any attention to legal patents. But there was a lot of money involved, and Groves didn't want anybody else outside the United States to get that. And then, of course, there was the further problem that, foreigners are very likely to be communists too. So Groves very early on recognized that that the Soviet Union represented a major threat, and that Soviet spying in particular represented a major threat. He was very worried about it before there was even any evidence of it. And then, of course, as it turned out, he was absolutely right. So, this was a very natural thing to suspect people who were not American citizens. I mean, Halban and Kowarski weren't even Frenchmen. God knows where they were from, that kind of a thing. And Jews or half Jews in addition. Not a good thing in those days to be half Jews, which both Halban and Kowarski were.
So what happened after the war? Where did these
Well,
refugees go?
after the war, Joliot gathered them all back, except Halban. Kowarski told me everybody refused to go back to Joliot if Halban came. I thought, well, this is Kowarski. He chafed working under Halban, and you get on with him. And that's the problem with oral history. You don't trust memories. But I asked every other person, and every other person confirmed, yes, we would not go back to work with Joliot if Halban came with us. So it shows that oral history sometimes can be valuable if you get enough people to confirm it. Halban, he had just become abrasive and aggressive and tried to take control of everything. As I say, he conceived himself as the representative of France, and between his German background and wealthy background and his sense of superiority, he simply grated on everybody, and they decided they could get along fine without him. So the British gave him a job, and he got on fine in Britain. But the rest of them came back to work with Joliot. Joliot was now not only a great Nobel Prize winner and the heir to the Curie's fame, but also a war hero for his work in the resistance, recognized as being connected with the most amazing thing ever in human history, the atomic bomb. And so he was able to get himself set up with help of Dautry and others, and an Atomic Energy Commission, the CEA, the Commissariat for Atomic Energy, whose mission was to produce nuclear reactors and get France into the nuclear energy business. Kowarski built their first reactor, ZOE, again, a nice acronym. Kowarski showed his administrative powers there with the help of a lot of information, of course, that he had brought back from Canada, some of which came from the United States ultimately, and some of which he had developed himself. And Goldschmidt was there, and Francis Perrin, who we haven't mentioned, a theorist, and a number of other people, and set to work in the complete chaos and misery of post-war France to set up a new source of energy. It didn't hurt that France was absolutely devastated. The power went off all the time. If you could even get power, they were short on coal. People were literally freezing in the dark. So getting a new source of energy was certainly a good idea for post-war France. Also, France, of course, didn't have any oil.
So how did this play out? Here, from the first plant, which was after the war, let's see, they probably in the 40s, late 40s?
Yeah, set up 46 and proceeded in what we would recognize as standard route. You build an experimental reactor, a very low power reactor, so everybody learns how to do it. And you go and you acquire uranium, which it turns out that uranium is everywhere. If you want it badly enough, you can find a source of very low-grade uranium. So people went around France with Geiger counters, finding bits and pieces of it. And you figure out, you cooperate with people abroad who are doing the same things, and you build up a nuclear industry. So at a certain point, it becomes an engineering and an administrative problem, which of course Joliot was very good at. And along the side, you do your research and so on. But it becomes a question at this point of industrial development. The hitch, of course, was that if you build a reactor, then you're building a way to get an atomic bomb. The French, needless to say, were very well aware of this, but as we have seen with many other countries since, you can go a long way saying, all we want to do is do peaceful nuclear energy. And then 10 years later, you say, oh, look, we have all of this stuff around. We can make a bomb with it. That was basically the route that the French had. Joliot would have none of it. He believed that there were enough weapons in the world. He believed that science should be used only for peace. And of course, at this point, he was a communist. So he had joined the Communist Party simply as part of being part of the patriotic anti-fascist resistance. But the Communist Party, as many people recognized at the time, but many people did not recognize, it was what we now call a closed information system. You believed what the party people said and what the party newspapers and so forth said. Anything that anybody else said was fake news. So the ideas of the gulag, of the mass starvation, the show trials, all that was fake news. And the Communist Party were the good guys and doing the good things. The Communist members were supposed to get together once a week with other Communist Party members, kind of to reinforce one another and to quash any heretical ideas that the party members might have. So it was almost like a cult. And Joliot was caught up in this. Eventually, all your close friends and people you communicate with are communists. And so he became caught up pretty much in the communist world. The Atomic Energy Commission naturally had quite a few communist people in it. This was not so unusual in France after the war. The Communist Party was a major political party. Many, many Frenchmen were communists. They were accepted by a lot of the intellectuals. You know, people like Sartre and so forth were famously sympathetic with the communists for much longer than they should have been. And it was not unnatural for there to be lots of engineers and scientists and so forth who went into the Atomic Energy Commission to just as they would go anywhere else. But it was also a friendly place for them. I was actually able to find out roughly how many there were there, because Communist Party cell is supposed to split after when it reaches a certain level of membership, I think 30 or whatever. And at one point I found birthday congratulations, I think it was to Joliot, from the members of the 2 communist cells within the CEA, and then a year later from the 3 communist cells within the CEA. So it gives you a feeling for a fair number, a lot more than you would have found in the railroads, but then this was a engineering and scientific and very progressive thing. But from the viewpoint of the anti-communists, it was riddled with Reds. So it was a very suspicious organization. And then Joliot, being a very prestigious person and also a communist, was exploited by the communists to become a leader in the world movement for disarmament, the anti-nuclear weapons movement. Very big, you know, millions of Frenchmen signed petitions, hundreds of millions of people around the world signed petitions for the abandonment of nuclear weapons, which of course all in the interest of the Soviet Union. If the United States promised to abandon its nuclear weapons, and maybe they would if the Soviet Union promised to abandon its nuclear weapons, everybody knew they'd put them in tunnels or whatever, except Joliot, who was politically, one would say, pretty naive. He fell in with the communists. He made speeches. He sincerely believed in disarmament and world peace. And when he finally definitively said that he would not participate in anything in the Atomic Energy Commissariat that would contribute to building nuclear weapons, he was fired. Not unsurprising. This was 1950. The the Cold War had begun. The United States didn't even have to pressure France. There's no sign that they pressured France. The French had plenty of reasons on their own at that point, with anti-communism on the rise, to get somebody else in charge of their Atomic Energy Commission and root out the communists who were in there. You know, find out the ones who were the most dedicated and get rid of them. The Atomic Energy Commissariat continued to work towards peaceful nuclear developments, reactors and so forth. They had no particular need to do anymore, because until you have a lot of reactors, you don't need to worry about it. And then when de Gaulle came in, they said, okay, it's time to actually build them, and so they started building them.
And what year was that? At 58?
I forget, 58, 60, something like that, when they explicitly, started working on, how do we actually build one. But it was undoubtedly, surely France would have tried to do something. The countries that didn't, like Germany and Italy and Japan, had been the losers in the war. So France had been a half loser in the war. So it was kind of touch and go whether it would join with the real losers and not even try to make a bid for a nuclear energy, or whether it would go with the Britain and the Soviet Union and the United States and try to build up a full nuclear industry. And it is largely because of Marie Curie and the legacy of Marie Curie through the Radium Institute and Joliot and so forth, and ultimately the Atomic Energy Commissariat, that France became the country with the most nuclear reactors, the only country that gets 70% of its energy from nuclear energy, electrical energy, and has the classic triad of nuclear submarines and missiles and airplanes and so forth, and maintains itself in this sense in a full equality with the other nations.
The spies that were in Montreal, Alan Nunn-May, in 1946, has passed the Montreal lab secrets to the Soviet embassy in Canada. It was this.
This was one of the great shocks. The whole Canadian thing came under disrepute when it was found that Alan Nunn-May, one of the British workers there, had been one of these nice, fine, upper-class British people who believed in communism and passed secrets from the Montreal nuclear program onto the Soviets. His secrets, as it turned out, were much less important than ones that were being leaked from all over the United States Manhattan Project. But it was one of the first cases that came out into the open, and it was one of the things that led to increased hunting for spies, suspicion of foreigners, and in particular worries about what was going on with those French and British up in Canada. So it tended to accelerate the process of the United States excluding everybody who wasn't American from any kind of cooperation in nuclear affairs.
Maybe you want to talk about that issue, how it played out, especially with the legislation Congress passed to keep atomic energy kind of to Americans and not share.
Well, this was not so much a problem for the French because they couldn't have much hope of cooperating with the Americans, but they could hope to cooperate with the British, the long history of Franco-British cooperation, and the British had strong hopes of cooperating with the Americans. I mean, Churchill and Roosevelt had agreed there would be full cooperation. The British were the ones who kicked the Americans until they started working on nuclear energy, and so the British had high hopes that the cooperation that was established during the war with British, all the top British, and even Niels Bohr, who had emigrated to Britain, escaped to Britain, and all these other people going to Los Alamos to help build the atomic bomb. How long the United States would have maintained this once they no longer needed the British is hard to say, but certainly as they began to find more and more signs that there were British communists who were leaking things, increased their desire to have nothing more to do with it, to cut them off. We can do it on our own, we can beat them. Not only a matter of military security, they hoped, of course, to delay other countries getting the nuclear weapons. They didn't want the British to get it or anybody else in the world to get them. But also, it was widely believed that there were enormous commercial possibilities for nuclear reactors, and the nuclear energy was going to take over the entire world economy in the next 20 years and so forth, where electronics was old hat, nucleonics was the new thing, and so on. So it was also for standard capitalist commercial reasons and national advances that they wanted everybody else out, and so that they could dominate. Well, after all, this was late 1940s. The United States was producing half the industrial output of the entire world, since most of the rest of the industrial output was in rubble. So it was a normal thing for the Americans to say, we'll go it alone and we don't need to cooperate with anybody else, and we'll just cut you off.
Maybe we should touch on some of your larger themes of the scientists in power. That's how you name your book. So is this a double entendre? And
Scientists in power, when they came out with the French edition, was impossible. You can't say les savants au pouvoir. Sounds like a rallying cry or whatever. So they never did come up with a good French translation for my title. But now I'm talking about myself as a historian, and I found that other people have appreciated my book, Scientists in Power, because it attempts whole history. That within the course of 2 pages, you can go from the details of an experiment to people trading patents with industry, to talking with the military people, and then back down into the lab again to what people are doing on the lab bench to try to see all the forces that are working simultaneously. Of course, it's a unique story. It's a particularly good story for a historian because nuclear fission was so new that you can actually, a person who tries to understand what you're saying, you actually can't explain it to them, which you can't do with most physics developments. But fission, you can actually explain what was happening in the lab, and to the extent you can penetrate it, you can explain what was happening in the government ministries and so forth. And the major theme of my book, I got this is a little harder to translate. The book starts with Les cerveaux sont fâcheusement pourvus d'estomac. Brains, unfortunately enough, are attached to stomachs. And that's the main theme that I try to address is how do these scientists find support? What makes it possible for them? What they really want to do is to discover knowledge. That's their main thing. They don't want to live in poverty. They want to live comfortable, upper middle class, cultured lives. But as long as they have that, what they really want to do, they don't want to go out and shove people around. They want to do scientific knowledge. But that doesn't mean they don't want to change the world. They do want to change the world, but it's their belief that by developing scientific knowledge and past that technology and engineering and so forth, they will change the world, and they're convinced that this will be for the better. There's been some doubt about whether knowing more makes you better off, but at least it gives you more choices. And this is what they wanted to do, and this is what they did do. Although half of their work had to be done on the laboratory bench, but going around to ministries saying, we need some more funding for the young scientists, going to industrialists saying, well, if you give us this uranium, then we'll be able to discover things, then you'll be able to make more money out of it, going to the public and arguing that, we need this kind of a political system in order to support science. They don't care about, they did care about the plight of the worker and all that kind of thing, but their main concern was that they had a political system that would support science, because over the long run, this was what was most important to them, and what they believed, not without justification, was the best thing that they could do with their lives to improve the world and prospects for future civilization. And this goes back to the late 19th century. Well, it goes back to the Enlightenment. But it's particularly a feature of the Third Republic. Marie Curie and her friends, Jean Perrin in particular, very noted physicist who made it one of his life goals to get in with the politicians. As I said, they all went to the École Normale together. They knew one another. It was a small circle. And to promote the scientific worldview and the development of science by raising funds for it. It goes back to the Dreyfus Affair, when France split in half, half of them being allied with the clerical side and even monarchists, and the other half being on the progressive side. By no means communists then, or even socialists, but just good liberals, internationalists looking towards good international relations. And the Curies and their people were entirely on that side. It was a fairly small social circle. The top levels in the French intellectual circles were small. They knew artists. You go into one of these people's apartments and you probably find some good works of art, which they might have done themselves, because everybody was very cultured. They did their literature. They could write fluently and so forth. This was a particular circle at a particular time from the during the heyday of the Third Republic, from, let's say, the 1890s to the 1920s. And this is not just Joliot, it's this entire circle that set themselves to advance French science, and thereby to advance world science, and thereby to advance civilization.
Talking about the circle, could you talk a little bit about the Langevin family and the relationships with the Curie family?
Well, Langevin, as I've already said Langevin was extremely important in promoting Joliot's career at several places. But they went way back because Langevin was a significant figure in the before the war. He was a good friend of the Curies and Jean Perrin, all these other people. And sometime after Pierre died, he became Marie's lover for a short period, which unfortunately became exposed and led to a terrible scandal, so they broke apart, and after that simply remained friends. And he was one of those people. He was a bit more progressive, as we would say, and actually was one of the first to join the communists. He became a communist already during the Popular Front days, for which the Nazis tried to gather him in during the war, but he was such a popular, senior figure that they eventually had to release him. Of course, in August, everybody in France goes on vacances, and where do you go? Well, in some cases, you go to Brittany. And Langevin and Jean Perrin and some others had found this little Breton town, Lark West, charming town like all of them are, and bought some summer places there, and eventually the Curies and others joined them, and this was their little summer circle, or the circle during the vacances, where the children would go and play in the water and that sort of a thing. So again, it was an example of the social cohesion that this circle had during this heyday of the Third Republic. That not only were they in Paris, so literally all within walking distance of one another, but even on their vacances, they were basically within walking distance of one another and could carry on their friendly social relations and intellectual discussions and raising their children to a certain extent together, all of that kind of thing. Not possible now. The number of scientists, the number of intellectuals, the number of everything has increased so explosively that it is no longer possible for all the top scientists, let alone all the top scientists, politicians, artists, intellectuals, to know one another intimately. Now not even all the top physicists recognize one another's names. There were how many people were graduates of the École Normale or the École Polytechnique? They don't have to pay attention to hardly anybody else. I mean, it was quite unusual for Joliot to come to be neither a Normalian nor a Polytechnicienne and still reach the very top circles. It would not have been possible without A, his own brilliance, both scientifically and in his personality, and B, the openness of the Curie circle to outsiders, be they from Poland or Russia, or be they Jews, or God forbid, even not from the Normale of the Polytechnique.
And perhaps that's somewhat of a reflection on the fact that Marie herself.
Oh yes, it all goes back to Marie Curie and her decision to leave her native country.
Tell us about that decision. Was it easy for her?
I don't know about that decision in particular, but
I'll leave that for Helen.
If she wanted to be a scientist, and she did, there was no way to be that in Poland. Even for a man, because of the Russian occupation, it would have been very difficult. And for a woman, no matter how brilliant, no matter how determined, the only route from Poland to any kind of career was through Paris. And she was only one of many Eastern Europeans who went to Paris in those years. Kowarski being another, of course.
To what extent was Marie, when she got to France, confronting barriers because she was a woman?
Well, she was one of the very few women who managed to push her way into the French scientific establishment. And she did it partly because she was willing to put up with it, the living in the garret. If she hadn't fallen in love with Pierre and he hadn't fallen in love with her, I don't know whether she could have succeeded. That was certainly gave her a leg up in the whole process. She was being supported before that. I mean, Jean Perrin, Becquerel, and other leading people recognized her as someone who should be supported. But whether she could have gotten the support that was necessary for the radium work, I don't know. And of course, she needed Pierre's instruments also. So it's a collaboration.
Well, we left Irene off a bit after her Nobel Prize and then Joliot stepped up to his administrative duties and is running.
No, I did cover that. She discovered nuclear fission but didn't know it.
Oh, that's right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And after the war, she continued her radioactivity research. What's probably worth saying about Irene and about these things in general, again, she was a woman scientist and she supported women scientists, as Marie Curie did. There were two unusual characteristics of the Radium Institute and also of Irene's work. One was a lot of people from Eastern Europe, and the other was a lot of women. So Marie primarily, but also Irene to a certain extent, became a role model for women scientists. When I was doing research on this, I would go into many labs and so forth in France, and if it was a woman's lab, you might very well find a picture of Marie Curie up on the wall. It almost became excessive, you know. The French were going to say, aren't there any other women scientists? You know, enough with Marie Curie, let's remember. There's lots of other women scientists, but there's no question that in France in particular, but also worldwide, that Marie Curie inspired many women to go into scientific fields who otherwise would not have done so. And to the extent that they were able to, they not only inspired them, but they also found money for them, and money and jobs.
That's very interesting.
I imagine to this day, I don't know, but I'll bet if you walked into the Radium Institute, you would find a higher fraction of women there than you would in other nuclear labs. Well, I think it's worth saying another word about Joliot-Curie, because this again is the French thing. Now here we have the polytechnicien side of it, the engineering side, the connections, close connections with the military and the government. Later on became one of the leaders of the SNCF, the very successful French railroad system. The reason France has been so successful with its nuclear reactors, of course, goes back to Joliot and all those, but it also goes back to the idea of a close collaboration with a fairly small circle of elite, well-trained, well-educated, cooperative people in industry and government all working together. This, of course, France is notoriously dirigiste. The United States, people tried to, every company wanted to build its own type of nuclear reactor. And the result, of course, was huge cost overruns and problems of safety and so forth. France organized itself much better. United States had the right idea when they got Rickover, the guy from the Navy, to run their nuclear Navy program, but the French were smarter still. They basically turned the whole program over to Navy officers and submarine. In a submarine, nothing can go wrong. Okay, so it's exactly the right spirit that you want to have in your nuclear reactor program. So there's something about the way that the French organized their society at that time. I'm not saying now, but that the way the French society was organized during the late Third and the Fourth Republic, that made it particularly able to build up a reliable, safe, economical nuclear energy system, which I hope can still be a model for the world, because, to turn to my other main historical interest, climate change is going to sink civilization unless we can change things very rapidly. And we don't need A, B, or C. We need all of the above, and we need nuclear reactors like France have. Without those, and without many other things, without solar, without wind, without conservation, without 20 other things I could name, but also including nuclear reactors, without them we're sunk. So I very much hope that the French will continue to inspire people by their success in this area.